The forbidden choice. The grand halls of Velmera's royal palace shone with golden light. Tonight was a night of celebration. The Aelari people, tall and elegant with shimmering silver skin, moved gracefully across the marble floors. The air was filled with soft music, laughter, and the quiet hum of telepathic conversations. But Princess Siren felt trapped. She sat on the high throne, wearing a royal blue gown that sparkled under the chandeliers. Her long silver hair was woven with tiny crystals. She looked like a queen, but she did not feel like one. Before her, a line of suitors stood, each one more impressive than the last. They were Aelari princes from powerful families, warriors who had conquered planets, scholars who had mastered ancient knowledge. They had all come for one reason: to ask for her hand in marriage. But Siren had no interest in any of them. A choice already made. The first prince, Lord Siren, stepped forward. His dark violet eyes burned with pride. "Princess Siren," he said, his voice smooth, "our union would strengthen the Aelari race. Together, we would lead our people into a new age of power." Siren kept her face calm. She had heard this speech 100 times before. Every prince wanted power, but none cared about her heart. "I am honored, Lord Siren," she replied, "but I must decline." A murmur spread through the room. The Aelari did not expect rejection. Siren's expression darkened, but he bowed and stepped back. The next suitor, Prince Calith, took a step forward. He was the most powerful warrior among the Aelari nobles. His golden armor gleamed under the palace lights. "I have fought in your father's wars," Calith said proudly. "I have won many battles. I am the strongest prince here. If you choose me, no enemy will ever stand against you." Siren sighed internally. Calith was strong, yes, but he was also arrogant. He spoke of war, but she wanted peace. "I respect your strength, Prince Calith," she said carefully, "but my answer remains the same." A sudden tension filled the hall. Calith's jaw tightened. He had expected victory, not rejection. He stepped back, his golden eyes flashing with hidden rage. The king, Siren's father, shifted uncomfortably on his throne. His patience was wearing thin. "Siren, my daughter," he said in a low voice, "this is the third time you have refused your suitors. The Aelari need a strong leader. You must choose." Siren clenched her fists in her lap. She knew her duty, but why should she marry someone she did not love? Her heart had already made a choice, even if no one knew. She was fascinated by someone forbidden. A human. The human who stood tall. Across the grand hall, among the alien nobles and warriors, stood Commander Elias Carter. Unlike the Aelari, he had no shimmering silver skin, no glowing eyes, no telepathic abilities. He was simply human, but he stood with confidence, his back straight, his gaze sharp. His presence was an insult to the Aelariolite. They saw humans as lesser beings, useful only for trade or alliance treaties. But Elias did not act like he was lesser. He stood like an equal. And Siren noticed. Her gaze flickered toward him for just a moment, but Calith saw it. The warrior prince narrowed his eyes. A human. Was the princess seriously ignoring Aelari royalty for a weak, primitive creature? Calith smirked and stepped forward again. "It seems our princess is blind to greatness," he said loudly. The room fell silent. Calith turned toward Elias, his golden armor gleaming. "Tell me, human," he said, "what do your people know of true strength?" Elias smirked. "Oh, I don't know," he said, his deep voice calm. "We've only survived wars, famine, and space travel with no telepathic gifts. We've built cities on dead planets. We've fought against enemies 10 times stronger, and won." A ripple of shock went through the Aelari nobles. No human had ever spoken so boldly in their presence. Siren hid her smile behind her glass of wine. Elias never backed down, and she admired that. Calith's smirk faded. He was not used to being challenged. "Bravery without power is foolishness," he said coldly. Elias shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe power without humility is just weakness in disguise. The room went silent. Saren felt her heartbeat quicken. Elias was the only one who dared to challenge the Aelari nobles. He saw them for what they were, not gods, not invincible, just another race with flaws. And that was why she found him so irresistible. The beginning of the storm. The king's face hardened. "Enough," he said. "The princess will choose from Aelari blood. This discussion is over." Caliph shot Elias a warning look. "Careful, human," he whispered. "You don't belong here." Elias didn't flinch. He simply met Caliph's eyes and grinned. "We'll see about that." Saren watched them both. She knew this was just the beginning. She had refused every Aelari prince. But deep in her heart, she already knew only one man had captured her attention. A man who was not Aelari at all. A human. A dance that sparks a war. The grand palace of Velmera stood like a silent guardian under the twin moons, its silver spires piercing the dark sky. Inside, the royal ball was in full swing, a celebration of diplomacy and unity, or so it seemed. Princess Saren knew better. She sat at the head of the banquet hall, her posture regal but her mind far away. Around her, the Aelari elite floated gracefully across the marble dance floor, their shimmering gowns and robes catching the soft golden light. The music was elegant, the laughter controlled, the movements perfectly calculated. Everything was as it should be, except for the unwelcome presence of a human. Commander Elias Carter stood near the edge of the ballroom, leaning casually against a pillar, his sharp blue eyes watching the room like a hunter scanning for prey. He was different from every other man in the room. Where the Aelari were ethereal and refined, Elias was solid, grounded, real. And Saren could not stop looking at him. A dangerous invitation. The Aelari nobles whispered behind their crystal goblets. A human in their royal halls was already an insult, but the way he carried himself, the way he looked at their princess, was outright defiance. Prince Caliph, the strongest warrior among them, was watching too. His golden eyes were locked onto Elias with cold fury. He hated him. He hated how the human did not shrink in the presence of Aelari power. He hated the way Saren's gaze lingered on him. He hated that, for the first time, he felt something dangerous, jealousy. And so he acted. Caliph stepped forward and raised his voice, letting it echo through the ballroom. "Tell me, human," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "do your kind even understand the art of dance? Or is that too beneath your primitive nature?" The nobles laughed. Saren's hands curled into fists on her lap. But Elias grinned. "Oh, I don't know," he said, pushing off the pillar and stepping forward. His voice was calm, his smirk playful. "We've been known to enjoy a good dance. Though, I hear Aelari prefer a performance where no one steps out of line." The laughter stopped. Caliph's smirk faltered for half a second before he masked it with arrogance. "Perhaps you would like to prove it then." He extended a hand, his voice laced with mockery. "Shall I teach you the way of the Aelari?" Before Elias could respond, another hand reached out. "Saren." The room gasped as the princess rose from her throne and stepped forward, standing between the two men. Her silver-blue gown trailed behind her as she lifted her chin. "If anyone shall dance with the commander," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "it shall be me." A stunned silence followed. And then, without waiting for permission, she took Elias' hand. The dance that changed everything. The musicians hesitated. This was not planned. A human and a princess. It was unheard of. It was forbidden. But Saren did not care. And neither did Elias. As the first notes of the waltz filled the air, they moved. It was supposed to be a dance of grace and control, but Elias brought something different. Fire. He led with confidence, his movements bold but smooth, guiding Saren across the floor with strength rather than formality. And Saren followed. For the first time, she wasn't moving because she was expected to. She was moving because she wanted to. Her pulse quickened. The world faded. There was no audience, no judgment, only the rhythm, the heat of his touch, and the quiet electricity in the air. The Aelari watched in shock. The human was not stumbling. He was not intimidated. He was leading their princess. Calith's hands clenched into fists. The nobles whispered in outrage. The king's expression darkened. This was not just a dance anymore. This was a challenge. The storm breaks. As the final notes played, Elias twirled Siren one last time before pulling her close. For the briefest second, their faces were inches apart, their breaths mingling. And then, applause. Not from the Aelari nobles, but from the human delegation standing at the edge of the hall. They clapped and whistled, unbothered by the glares of the Aelari elite. Elias chuckled, stepping back with an easy grin. Not bad for a primitive, huh? Siren let out a soft, breathless laugh. Not bad at all. Calith had had enough. He stepped forward, his voice booming with authority. This is an insult to our people. The room fell into silence once more. This human has disrespected our traditions, our ways. Calith's golden eyes burned with fury as he turned to the king. Your Majesty, allow me to challenge him. A duel, to remind him of his place. Siren's heart stopped. She turned to her father, whose gaze was unreadable. He did not look at her, only at Elias. Elias, for his part, did not flinch. He rolled his shoulders, tilting his head slightly, a lazy smirk tugging at his lips. A duel? He mused. Well, that escalated quickly. Siren grabbed his arm. You don't have to accept this. Elias looked at her, his eyes, always sharp and full of mischief, softened for just a moment. Then he turned back to Calith. All right, he said. Let's dance again. Love or betrayal? The air inside the Velmera Grand Hall was thick with tension, the scent of burning incense mixing with the quiet murmur of the stunned Aelari nobles. A human had just challenged an Aelari warrior prince to a duel. Such a thing had never happened before. Siren's heart pounded in her chest as she stood between Commander Elias Carter and Prince Calith, both men now standing at the center of the hall. Around them, the noble spectators watched in complete silence, their glowing eyes narrowed in shock and amusement. This was madness. This was forbidden. And yet Elias looked completely unbothered. Calith, on the other hand, was seething. His golden armor gleamed under the chandelier's soft light, his fists clenched with barely contained rage. He had been humiliated once tonight, and he would not allow a mere human to walk away unpunished. The king rose from his throne, his silver eyes cold and calculating. Enough, he said, his deep voice carrying through the vast hall. There will be no duel in my palace. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but Calith didn't move. His sharp gaze flickered toward Siren before settling on Elias once more. You are lucky, human, he spat. The king shows you mercy. Elias, as usual, did not take the insult seriously. He smirked, crossing his arms. Mercy, he mused, or fear. Gasps erupted across the hall. Calith lunged forward, but Siren stepped between them. Enough, she snapped, her voice sharper than a blade. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the king sighed, rubbing his temple. Siren, come with me, he ordered. His voice held no room for argument. Siren hesitated but nodded, her gaze lingering on Elias for a moment longer before following her father out of the ballroom. A choice that cannot be undone. The king's private chamber was vast and cold, lined with ancient tapestries that told the history of the Aelari race. Siren stood before the throne, her father watching her with unreadable eyes. You humiliated your people tonight, he said. Siren straightened. I danced. You danced with a human, he snapped, a lesser being who has no place among our kind. Siren's jaw tightened. You always told me to choose a suitor who is strong, she said, her voice unwavering. And yet, when a man stands in your halls with strength not of power, but of will, You refuse to see it. The king's expression darkened. Enough, Seren. You will marry an Aelari noble, or I will choose one for you. Her heart clenched. A forced marriage, a life spent beside a man she did not love. And then came the final blow. If you refuse, then Elias Carter will be banished from Velmera. Seren's breath hitched. She had expected this. She knew the king would never allow her interest in a human to continue. But to exile him, to send him away forever. She felt as if the ground beneath her feet had cracked open. The king watched her carefully. You must make your choice by sunrise, he said. You will choose duty, or you will lose him forever. Seren did not answer. She turned and walked out of the chamber, her mind racing. The confession. Seren found Elias standing on a balcony overlooking the glowing city below. The cool night breeze lifted his dark hair, and when he turned to see her, his signature smirk softened. Let me guess, he said. I'm being kicked off the planet. Seren hesitated, then nodded. Elias exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Figures. For the first time, Seren saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Hesitation. Elias Carter, the man who had challenged an Aelari prince without blinking, looked like he was holding something back. She stepped closer. I could stop this, she whispered. Elias arched a brow. And how exactly would you do that? She swallowed. The king gave me a choice. If I agree to marry an Aelari noble, he will let you leave unharmed. Elias' smirk disappeared. Silence stretched between them. Seren felt her pulse hammering in her chest. She had fought against this feeling for so long, but now, standing before him, she could no longer deny it. I don't want to lose you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he let out a breath and shook his head. You don't owe me anything, Seren, he said softly. Don't sacrifice your freedom for me. Seren clenched her fists. And what about you? You would just leave. He exhaled. Do you really think I'd go quietly? He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. I'll find a way back. No matter what. The words sent a shiver down her spine. No matter what. Seren knew that if he stayed, he would be hunted. If he tried to return, he would be killed. And yet Elias did not care. For the first time in her life, she saw a man who would risk everything for her. The realization terrified her, and it thrilled her. The decision that changed everything. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, Seren stood before her father once more. The king watched her expectantly. Your choice. Seren lifted her chin. I will not marry an Aelari noble, she said, her voice firm. A hall fell silent. And as for Elias Carter, she continued, if you exile him, then I will leave with him. A collective gasp rang through the court. The king's eyes flashed with fury. You would leave your own people? For a human? Seren met his gaze. For the only man who ever treated me as an equal. For a moment, her father said nothing. Then, in a low, dangerous voice, he said, Then you are no longer my daughter. The words struck like a blade, but Seren did not let herself falter. She turned on her heel and walked away, toward the only future that felt real. Elias was waiting, and this was just the beginning. The ultimate betrayal. The royal city of Velmera was waking up, bathed in the soft golden glow of dawn. The towering silver spires stood proud against the sky, their reflections shimmering in the grand rivers that ran through the city. But inside the palace, a storm was brewing. The king's decree had sent shockwaves through the Aelari elite. Princess Seren, the heir to the throne, had chosen exile with a human. An insult, a betrayal. The nobles whispered, their voices laced with anger and disbelief. And among them, Prince Calith stood in silence, his golden eyes burning with something darker than rage. She had chosen the human over him. Calith clenched his fists as he watched the palace guards rush to secure the gates. The king had declared that Seren must not be allowed to leave. The honor of the Alari Empire was at stake. But it was too late. Saren and Commander Elias Carter had already escaped into the night. A desperate escape. The royal hangars were heavily guarded, making escape nearly impossible. But Saren knew the palace better than anyone. She led Elias through the narrow servant tunnels, past hidden doors and forgotten corridors. The night air was crisp as they emerged on the outskirts of the city, where a sleek human-made transport ship was waiting in the shadows. Elias turned to her as they hurried up the ramp. "I have to ask," he said, slightly out of breath, "did you plan all this ahead of time, or are you just very good at last-minute escape plans?" Saren gave him a sideways glance. "You don't grow up in a golden cage without learning where the keys are hidden." The ship's engines roared to life. Inside, Elias' crew, 3 humans and a former Alari pilot, rushed to prepare for takeoff. The moment Saren stepped aboard, she knew there was no turning back. As the ship lifted off, a sudden explosion rocked the ground below. "Shields up!" Elias shouted. Saren's heart pounded as she saw Alari warships rising from the palace hangars, their sleek forms cutting through the sky. They had expected a pursuit, but not this quickly. Elias turned to Saren. "I hope you're not afraid of a little turbulence." Saren's lips curled into a smirk. "I hope you're not afraid of losing." The ship blasted into hyperspace, vanishing before the Alari fleet could lock onto them. For now, they were free. But freedom came at a price. The cost of love. Hours later, they landed on a remote moon, far from the Alari territories. The settlement was small, hidden deep within rocky canyons, where outcasts, rebels, and smugglers found refuge. As they stepped off the ship, Elias glanced at Saren. "No turning back now," he said. Saren took a deep breath. "I made my choice." He studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching hers. "You gave up everything for me." She shook her head. "I didn't give up anything. I just finally took what was mine." Elias exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You're impossible. And you're reckless." A slow smile spread across his lips. "You love that about me." Saren opened her mouth to argue, but she couldn't, because it was true. But before she could reply, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them. The sky lit up with fire. The Alari had found them. The betrayal. Saren and Elias rushed back to the ship, but before they could reach it, Alari soldiers dropped from the sky, their plasma rifles aimed and ready. Saren's blood turned cold. How did they find us so fast? Elias narrowed his eyes. "Someone gave us up." A voice rang out from behind the soldiers. "It was me." Saren's breath caught in her throat as she turned, and saw Calith stepping forward. His golden armor gleamed under the dim light of the twin moons. His face was calm, but his eyes were unreadable. Saren knew that look. It was the same look he had given her before every battle. Determined, ruthless, unstoppable. "You betrayed us," Saren whispered. Calith tilted his head slightly. "No," he said. "You betrayed us." He turned his gaze to Elias. "And you took something that did not belong to you." Elias grinned despite the danger. "If you mean Saren, I didn't take her. She chose to leave." Calith's jaw tightened. "You think this is a game?" Elias shrugged. "I don't know. You Alari sure seem to love playing games with people's lives." Calith took a slow step forward. "I should kill you right now." Saren stepped between them. "No," she said firmly. "This stops here." Calith's gaze flickered to her. "You still think you can reason with me?" She held his stare. "I think you're better than this." For the briefest second, something uncertain flashed in his eyes. But then, in a cold voice, he said, "You don't know me at all." He raised his hand, and the soldiers grabbed Elias. Saren fought back, twisting free from the guards who tried to hold her. But before she could reach Elias, Calith grabbed her wrist, pulling her close. His voice was a whisper against her ear. "I will give you one last chance, Saren. Her heart pounded. "Come back with me," Caliph said. "I will convince the king to forgive you. You can still be the princess. You can still have everything." Seren's pulse thundered in her ears. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Caliph's grip tightened. "Then he dies." She stilled. Caliph wasn't bluffing. Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. If she went back, she could save Elias' life. If she refused, he would die. But she would be free. The choice was impossible. But she had to choose. Escape and revelation. The air was thick with tension. The cold wind of the Velmaran outlands whipping through the ruined settlement where Seren, Elias, and their crew had been hiding. The sky above burned with the golden glow of Alari warships, their silhouettes menacing against the twin moons. The betrayal was complete. Prince Caliph had tracked them, had sold them out, had led the king's forces straight to them. And now, Elias was bound in energy restraints, his face still wearing that damn grin, even as Alari guards held him at gunpoint. And Seren, she stood before Caliph, her former friend, her most persistent suitor, the man who now offered her an impossible choice. Return with him to Velmera and reclaim her throne, saving Elias' life. Or refuse, and watch the human she loved die. Caliph's golden eyes bore into hers. Decide, Seren. A choice in the dark. Elias' voice cut through the silence. I hate to break up this touching moment, but if I'm going to die, can we at least speed it up? The suspense is killing me. Caliph's gaze flickered toward him, unimpressed. You are an insect, human. Elias smirked. And yet, I'm the one you're obsessed with. Seren's heart pounded. This wasn't a game. She knew Caliph well enough to see the truth. He meant every word. He wasn't just trying to bring her back out of duty anymore. This was personal. Seren, Elias said, quieter this time. His smirk was gone, replaced by something real, something raw. Don't do this. Don't go back for me. Caliph stepped closer. There is no other way. Seren exhaled sharply. Her mind raced. There was always another way. She just had to find it. She let her eyes dart over the guards, the weapons, the layout of the rocky settlement. She had trained in palace war strategy since she was young. If she could find the weakness in this formation. And then she saw it. The Alari relied on their telepathic abilities to sense movements and thoughts, but that meant they were vulnerable to direct, unpredictable action. Speed over strategy. Chaos over control. She looked at Elias. He saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes and gave the smallest nod. That was all she needed. She moved. The escape. Everything happened in seconds. Seren lunged, not toward Caliph, but toward the nearest guard. She grabbed the hilt of his plasma dagger before he could react, twisting it free and slamming it into the restraints on Elias' wrists. A burst of energy. The shackles short-circuited. Elias reacted instantly, throwing a vicious punch into the nearest guard's face and ripping a weapon from his holster. The outpost erupted into chaos. Seren turned, blocking Caliph's counterattack with a sharp parry of her stolen dagger. You fight well, Caliph growled, golden eyes flashing. You taught me. Seren shot back, spinning to avoid his next strike. Elias was already moving, shooting out the floodlights, plunging the entire area into darkness. And in that split second, their crew appeared. Blaster fire cut through the air as Seren's allies struck from the shadows, overwhelming the surprised Alari troops. The battle was fierce, but it was over in moments. Caliph, breathing hard, wiped blood from his lip as his forces fell back. You think this is over? He snarled. Elias grinned, his blaster still smoking. Oh, I'm counting on it not being over. They ran. Toward their ship, toward the sky, toward freedom. But as the ramp closed behind them, Seren knew one thing for certain. Caliph would not stop. And soon, neither would the king. The revelation. As the ship tore through hyperspace, Seren sat in the cockpit, staring out at the endless black. Elias stepped beside her, silent for a moment. Then, "We did it." Saren turned to him, her expression unreadable. "No, we survived." Elias studied her. "Something's on your mind." She hesitated. And then, finally, she said it. "There's something wrong with the Alari." Elias frowned. "More than usual." Saren's hands curled into fists. "More than anyone knows." She had grown up with the Alari belief that they were the supreme species, that their telepathic abilities made them the most evolved race in the galaxy. But now, she wasn't so sure. "Their power isn't natural," she whispered. "They've hidden it for centuries, but I think the Alari stole their abilities from another race. And if that's true," Elias leaned forward, "then your people aren't as powerful as they pretend to be." Saren nodded. "And if the truth gets out, the entire empire could fall." Silence stretched between them. Elias let out a slow whistle. "No wonder Calith's obsessed with you. You're holding the key to the biggest secret in their history." Saren turned to him. "We have to find out the truth." Elias smirked. "I love it when you talk rebellion." She rolled her eyes, but a small smile tugged at her lips. This was only the beginning. The war for love and freedom. The hunt begins. The darkness of space stretched endlessly beyond the ship's windows, a vast ocean of stars and silence. But Saren knew that silence wouldn't last. They were being hunted. Elias stood at the helm of the cockpit, hands on the controls, jaw set in a familiar smirk that hid his exhaustion. The rest of the crew sat behind them, weapons half-loaded, minds still racing from the escape. The Alari Empire didn't take betrayal lightly. Saren turned to Elias. "They'll track us." Elias glanced at her, amused. "I'd be insulted if they didn't." She folded her arms. "You're too calm." "And you're too tense," he countered. "What happened to the princess who danced with me in front of an entire empire?" She realized that the empire wants her dead. Saren muttered. Elias chuckled. "Yeah, welcome to my world." Before she could reply, an alarm blared through the ship. Saren's stomach dropped. The Alari fleet had found them. The Alari's new weapon. 3 warships appeared out of hyperspace, their sleek golden hulls glowing against the void. Fast, precise, deadly. And leading them, Calith's personal command cruiser. "Of course, it's him," Elias muttered, flicking switches on the control panel. "Guy's obsessed." Saren's breath was tight in her chest. "He won't stop." "He can try," Elias said, before slamming a button on the console. "Strap in." The ship jerked violently as Elias dove into a chaotic maneuver, twisting through debris fields and asteroid belts, weaving through gravitational anomalies that would tear apart lesser pilots. But Calith's fleet wasn't just chasing them. They were hurting them. Saren's heart clenched as she saw it, the energy web forming around them, powered by Alari technology. "They're cutting off our escape routes," she yelled. Elias gritted his teeth. "I noticed." A sharp explosion rocked the ship. Sparks flew from the panels. Saren's hands tightened into fists. They were losing. She turned to the crew. "We need options. Now." One of the pilots, a scruffy human named Torin, cursed under his breath. "We could try to blast through, but our shields won't hold long." Saren's mind raced. Then, suddenly, an idea. "What if we don't break out?" she said. "What if we break in?" Elias blinked. "Come again." "We can't outrun them," Saren said. "But if we board Calith's flagship, disable it from the inside, we have a chance." Elias stared at her for half a second before laughing. "You want to break onto an Alari warship in the middle of battle? Do you have a better plan?" His grin widened. "Nope. Let's do it." The infiltration. The crew moved fast, shifting from escape mode to attack mode in seconds. Saren suited up in sleek black armor, strapping a plasma dagger to her thigh. Elias slung a rifle over his shoulder, flashing her a grin. I'm starting to think you like danger, he said. Saren rolled her eyes. You're just figuring that out. They launched their boarding pods, slamming through the defenses of Calith's flagship. The impact was violent. Smoke and fire filled the docking bay as the hatches blew open. And then they moved. Blaster fire exploded around them as Alari guards rushed in. Saren's dagger flashed, cutting through their ranks with deadly precision. Elias took down 2 soldiers in a heartbeat, dodging plasma bolts as they advanced through the ship's corridors. Saren knew the layout of Alari warships. She led them through the twisting hallways toward the command center. Elias glanced at her. Tell me there's an actual plan. There's a plan, she assured him. Good, Elias said, because we're about to have company. Behind them, an entire squad of Alari elite warriors closed in, and at the center of them, Calith. The confrontation. The command room exploded into chaos as the doors slammed open. Saren and Elias spun, weapons raised, only to come face to face with Calith. The prince's golden armor gleamed under the flickering lights, his sword humming with energy. His gaze locked onto Saren. You never stop running, he said, voice low. Saren didn't lower her weapon. Maybe you should stop chasing. Calith exhaled sharply. I didn't want it to come to this. Elias scoffed. Could have fooled me. Calith moved first, a blur of gold and speed. Saren barely blocked his strike, the impact rattling through her bones. Elias dodged a blast from the guards, returning fire. The room became a battleground. Saren's strikes were fast, precise, relentless, but Calith had trained her. He knew every move she made. Their blades clashed, sparks flying as their battle raged across the command deck. Elias, meanwhile, fought 4 guards at once, his rifle a blur of motion. But Calith was stronger, faster. And then he landed a hit. Saren gasped as pain flared through her side, Calith's blade slicing across her ribs. Elias saw it happen. His expression darkened. He turned and shot Calith in the shoulder. The prince staggered back, snarling in pain. But before he could recover, Saren lunged, driving her dagger toward his heart. And then suddenly, the entire ship shuddered. The Alari fleet had locked onto them. Saren's comlink crackled. Asterisk, princess. The fleet is preparing a full-scale attack. We have to go. Asterisk, no. Saren's breath was ragged. She looked at Calith, who was bleeding but still standing. This wasn't over. It would never be over. She turned to Elias. We have to get out of here. Elias grabbed her hand. Agreed. They ran. The aftermath. The escape was barely successful. Their ship shot back into hyperspace, damaged but intact. Saren sat in the cockpit, her hand pressing against her wounded side. Elias knelt beside her, checking her injury. You okay? He asked. She smirked despite the pain. You shot Calith. Elias grinned. Yeah, that was fun. Her smile faded. This war, it's not going to end. Elias nodded. Then we end it. She met his gaze. How? Elias leaned back, thoughtful. We expose the truth. We take away their greatest weapon, fear. A new plan was forming. A plan that could change the fate of the galaxy. The final choice. The war reaches its breaking point. Space was a vast, endless ocean of stars, but to Saren, it had never felt smaller. The moment their ship entered neutral space, she felt the weight of everything they had lost. The Alari Empire wanted them dead. Prince Calith was still hunting them. And the only way to end this war was to expose the biggest lie in Alari history, that their species' power was stolen from another race. But the problem? They had no proof. Yet, Elias sat at the controls, his gaze fixed ahead, though she knew he wasn't focused on the stars. She stepped beside him. What's on your mind? Elias exhaled. I'm thinking about what comes next. She raised an eyebrow. You're not usually the plan-ahead type. He grinned. Yeah. Well, it's different when we're planning to overthrow an entire empire. Saren gave a half-smile, but her chest was tight. This was it. The final battle was coming. And not all of them would survive it. The search for the truth. They needed evidence, something undeniable that would prove to the galaxy that the Aelari had stolen their power. And there was only one place where that proof could be found. The tomb of the first kings, the oldest ruins on Velmera, locked away in the deepest vaults of the empire. The place no one was allowed to enter. Which meant, of course, that they had to break in. The final heist. Saren's heart pounded as their ship descended through the storm clouds of Velmera. They weren't supposed to be here. The king had declared them traitors. Keleth was likely waiting for them. But this was the only chance they had. The crew split up. Elias and Saren would go inside the tomb, while the others set charges around the palace as a distraction. They moved like shadows, slipping through the ancient corridors of the tomb. Saren had studied the maps in secret when she was younger. This was the burial place of the first Aelari kings, the ones who had supposedly been gifted with their telepathic power. But that was a lie, and she was going to prove it. As they stepped deeper inside, the air grew colder. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, depicting the Aelari gods, or what they claimed were gods. Saren ran her fingers over the stone. "These aren't gods," she whispered. Elias frowned. "What are they?" Saren's stomach twisted as she stared at the images. The figures were twisted, broken, screaming. Not gods. Victims. The Aelari kings hadn't been given power. They had taken it, by draining the life force of another race. And then, they had erased that species from history. Saren's breath caught. They committed genocide. Elias' jaw tightened, and built their empire on it. This was the proof they needed. But before they could transmit the data, a voice echoed behind them. "I knew you would come here." Saren spun. Keleth. The final confrontation. Prince Keleth stood at the entrance, his golden armor gleaming in the dim torchlight. Behind him, a dozen royal guards blocked their only escape. But Keleth wasn't looking at Elias. His eyes were locked onto Saren. "You were always too curious," he said quietly. Saren clenched her fists. "And you were always too blind." Keleth sighed, stepping forward. "Do you think exposing this will change anything?" His voice was calm, almost sad. "Even if the truth comes out, the Aelari will never accept it." Elias scoffed. "People don't like being lied to." Keleth ignored him. "You can still stop this, Saren," he said. "Come back. Stand by my side. We can control the narrative. We can keep our people from falling apart." Saren stared at him. And for the first time, she saw the truth. Keleth wasn't fighting because he believed in the Empire. He was fighting because he was afraid of losing it. Saren's voice was steady when she spoke. "The Empire deserves to fall." Keleth's face darkened. "Then you leave me no choice." He lunged. The last battle. Keleth moved like a storm, his blade slicing through the air in a blur of golden light. Saren met his attack, her own dagger flashing as their weapons clashed. Elias took down two of the guards, dodging plasma blasts as he covered her back. But Keleth was relentless. Their fight spilled into the tomb, the ancient carvings glowing around them. Saren twisted, blocking the strike, then drove her dagger toward his heart. But Keleth caught her wrist. His grip was iron, his golden eyes wild. "I loved you," he whispered. Saren stared at him, and for the first time, she saw the boy he used to be. The boy who had trained with her, who had believed in something greater. But that boy was gone, and she would not save a ghost. She yanked free, then drove her dagger into his side. Keleth staggered, his breath hitching. Saren stepped back, her heart pounding. Keleth slowly sank to his knees, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes met hers one last time. And then, he fell. The truth is set free. Saren and Elias rushed to the control panel, uploading the evidence to the entire Aelari communication network. Within seconds, the truth was broadcasted across the empire. The people saw the carvings. They heard the stolen voices of the past. And the Elari Empire began to crumble. Saren felt it in the air, a shift, a breaking of chains. It was over. The lie had been shattered. The war had been won without an army. Only the truth had been needed. The final choice. As they stood in the ruins of the tomb, Saren turned to Elias. His expression was unreadable. So, what now, princess? Saren took a breath. She could go back, rebuild the Elari under a new rule. Or she could leave it behind forever. She looked at Elias, then at the stars beyond the ruins. And for the first time in her life, the choice was easy. She stepped forward, her voice steady. I'm not a princess anymore. Elias smirked. Good. I prefer rebels. She took his hand. And together, they walked toward the unknown future ahead. Free. Epilogue. A new beginning. The Elari Empire was changed forever. Some fought against the truth. But others began to hope. Saren and Elias disappeared into the stars, their names whispered in rebellion. They were legend now. And legends never die.